It's September 2025. A Finnair jet descends toward Helsinki. Mid-approach, the pilot's instruments go dark. No GPS, no guidance. The screen's blank. Over the Baltic, Russian electronic warfare units are jamming civilian navigation across northern Europe. NATO triggered Article 4 emergency consultations, but the attack stays below the Article 5 threshold. I'm David. The question, why has Russia calculated that blinding thousands of flights and ships is a cost NATO will tolerate? September 19, 2025. 3 Russian fighter jets crossed into Estonian airspace and stayed for 12 minutes. The kind of incursion that, a decade ago, would have triggered hours of phone calls between defense ministers. This time, it triggered a treaty mechanism. NATO jets, Italian, Finnish, Swedish, scrambled to intercept. Estonia invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, demanding emergency consultations across the 32-nation alliance. It was the second time that month. 10 days earlier, Russian drones had breached Polish airspace. Poland and Romania had triggered Article 4 then. But airspace incursions were only the visible edge. Across the Baltic, civilian pilots were watching their navigation screens flicker and fail. Russian jamming was knocking out GPS signals for commercial airliners. Passenger flights blinded by an electronic attack. The Kremlin called nothing of the kind. A NATO spokesperson described it as reckless Russian behavior. Russia denied it all. Here is what makes it dangerous. The attack falls below the threshold of armed assault, the line that would trigger Article 5, collective defense, all 32 nations going to war. Russia is testing exactly how far it can push without crossing that line. And so far, nobody outside the Kremlin knows where it actually is. That line has a name: the gray zone. NATO planners use the term for actions that destabilize without crossing into open warfare. Cyber attacks, sabotage, jamming, drone incursions. The point is plausible. Deniability, Russia can do them, and prove nothing definitively traces back to the Kremlin. According to the research, NATO has explicitly classified Russia's recent activities: the jamming, the drone overflights, the undersea cable sabotage, as gray zone operations. They damage civilian systems and rattle alliances, but stop short of the armed attack threshold that triggers Article 5. Article 5 is the founding promise of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all. Invoke it. And 32 nations are at war. Russia knows this. So instead of firing a missile, it fires a jamming signal at civilian aircraft. Instead of bombing a port, it cuts a cable. The damage adds up, and the alliance has to decide every single time whether this incident is the one that crosses the line. So far, the answer has always been no. The harder question is, what happens when the answer changes? The jamming has an address: Kaliningrad, a Russian enclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, surrounded by NATO countries on every side. One of the most militarized stretches of land in Europe. Some analysts suggest Russia operates dedicated electronic warfare units there, with antenna arrays pointed across the Baltic. Specific deployments and unit identifications are not public. Moscow does not publish that data, and NATO has not officially attributed individual installations. What the research does confirm is that Russian jamming persists near the Baltic coast as a continuing feature of hybrid warfare operations. The signals reach civilian aircraft on approach to airports in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Poland. Pilots adapt. They fall back on older inertial navigation, on visual flight rules, on radio beacons that have not been frontline technology since the 1970s. The fix works. The flights land. But every flight burning extra fuel on a workaround, every controller talking a pilot through a manual approach, is a cost. And the source of that cost sits less than 30 miles from a NATO border, broadcasting on frequencies the alliance can detect but cannot legally silence. Russia learned this playbook in one place: Ukraine. 3 years of combat against Ukrainian drones turned Russian electronic warfare into a working battlefield system. Jamming Ukrainian GPS-guided strike drones became routine, a daily exercise refined over thousands of intercepts. Then the side effects started spilling across borders. Ukrainian drones, disoriented by Russian jamming, crossed onto NATO soil. Polish and Romanian airspace was breached. The research notes NATO's response was relatively muted. The alliance treated the incursions as accidental byproducts of electronic warfare rather than deliberate attacks. That restraint was deliberate. Calling them deliberate would have meant escalation. Calling them accidents kept the situation manageable. But it also taught Moscow something. If NATO would absorb drones drifting onto its territory and label them accidents, Russia had its answer about what else the alliance would absorb. The jamming over the Baltic, civilian aircraft now flying through the same electronic attack refined against Ukrainian military drones, is the next iteration. The weapons are the same. The targets are no longer soldiers. They are passengers on a Tuesday morning flight from Helsinki to Riga. And the alliance still has not drawn a line. The hesitation has a price. It shows up first in the airline ledgers. The International Air Transport Association had forecast a record $41 billion in global airline profits for 2026, the industry's strongest year on paper. That forecast is now in doubt. Rising tensions and airspace closures around the world are eating into margins across the industry, and the Baltic jamming is part of that picture. Exact flight-by-flight cost data has not been published. Airlines tend to keep that quiet. But every diverted route burns extra fuel, and every canceled flight strands passengers. Controllers space out arrivals to absorb the delays. Northern European hubs are absorbing the impact. Helsinki, Tallinn, Riga, Vilnius all sit within range. And here is what makes it different from a normal weather delay. Weather passes. This does not. The signal is being broadcast intentionally around the clock from territory NATO cannot enter. Airlines cannot price for it. Insurers struggle to model it, and no regulator can switch it off. An industry built on redundancy is finding that its single biggest dependency, a satellite signal from 20,000 kilometers up, has no working backup. Which brings us to a transmitter on the British coast. In May 2026, the UK Ministry of Defence launched a program called Urgent Compass, a $6 million, 2-year contract with a Connecticut-led group called Team eLoran. The mission: build a deployable backup for GPS, fast. The technology is called eLoran, Enhanced Long-Range Navigation. It runs on ground-based radio towers broadcasting low-frequency signals at 90 to 110 kHz, accurate to within roughly 8 meters. Because eLoran broadcasts from the ground on a totally different frequency band, satellite jamming cannot touch it. The UK is not first. China is finishing eLoran timing stations at Dunhuang, Korla, and Nagua, expected operational in 2026. Underpinning Chinese financial, telecoms, and power grid systems. South Korea already runs a national network. The United States passed a law in 2018 mandating a GPS backup and has not deployed an operational system. So while NATO debates how to respond to gray zone attacks on Western navigation, China has quietly built the redundancy the West is now scrambling to copy. The question is whether 2 years is fast enough. There is a second option, already in orbit. The European Union's Galileo Public Regulated Service, Galileo PRS, broadcasts on 1575.42 MHz and 178.75 MHz. The signals are encrypted. The bandwidth is wide. The system is engineered to keep working under jamming and spoofing for authorized users, military forces, civilian emergency services, key infrastructure operators. On paper, this is the answer. Civilian GPS receivers cannot access it. Only authorized national systems can. Each member state has to build out the receivers, the ground stations, and a user community of certified operators. The adoption curve has been slow, running for years now, with most member states still in early rollout. The signal is broadcasting. The receivers, mostly, are not. So, Europe has two backup paths developing in parallel: Galileo PRS in space, eLoran on the ground. Neither is yet at the scale where it could absorb a wide GPS outage. The infrastructure is being laid down, slowly, deliberately, on peacetime timelines. Meanwhile, the jamming over the Baltic continues, every week, every flight. And the deeper question, the one nobody in NATO wants to answer out loud, is what happens before the backups are ready. The research is clear on which scenario the weight creates. The probability of direct Russian military action against the Baltic states is just 20% through 2029, meaning an 80% chance the gray zone holds and the line stays uncrossed. The bigger risk is miscalculation. A jammed drone hits a NATO airbase. A pilot mistakes a signal. A commander on either side reads the situation wrong and shoots before checking. The research uses one example directly: a rogue Russian commander making a call that does not reflect Moscow's strategy, then triggering a response no one wanted. Or Estonia seizing a Russian-flagged tanker from the so-called Shadow Fleet, the unregistered oil ships ferrying sanctioned Russian crude and Russian naval forces responding. Dozens of these flashpoints exist. Each one is small. Each one on its own could be contained. The danger is that they keep multiplying. The gray zone strategy works as long as everyone stays calm. The moment one incident moves faster than diplomats can step in, the framework collapses. The 80% probability holds, until it does not. And the line that finally gets crossed will probably be crossed by accident. Which is why the backup matters so much. The fix exists. The deployment does not. Urgent Compass is a 2-year contract, meaning the UK's deployable eLoran arrives, at the earliest, in 2028. Even then, it is a UK military system, not a continent-wide civilian one. Rolling eLoran across the rest of NATO would require fresh contracts, new towers, and political will from countries that have not started the conversation. Galileo PRS adoption is similarly slow. The European Commission has been pushing member states to certify and deploy receivers. Uptake has lagged. The United States, 8 years past its own legislative mandate, has funded no operational terrestrial backup. Some pilots are flying with handheld GPS units bought off the shelf. Civilian air traffic control has fallen back on procedures from before satellite navigation existed. These workarounds function. None of them solve the problem. Meanwhile, the jamming intensifies. Reports of GPS disruption over the Baltic continued through the spring of 2026, with no sign Moscow is pulling back. The gap is widening. The time it takes to deploy a resilient navigation network is measured in years, while the time it takes to broadcast a jamming signal is measured in seconds. Every day that gap stays open is another day Moscow can probe what the alliance will tolerate. Which means the probing is the entire point. This is what future conflict looks like. The jamming over the Baltic is the war itself, in a form designed not to be recognized as one. Russia has shown the alliance that it can blind civilian aircraft, trigger emergency consultations across 32 nations, force political decisions on NATO capitals, and walk away claiming none of it happened. No missile crossed a border. No soldier crossed a line. The red lines NATO drew remain, on paper, intact, and yet the testing continues. Article 4 was triggered 3 times in a single month last September. Civilian aviation is operating with a degraded backbone for the first time in 2 decades. The infrastructure designed to replace GPS is being built on peacetime timelines into a wartime threat. The data we reviewed projects more of the same through 2026, more incursions, deeper jamming, and probing that pushes a bit further each time. On current trends, that line gets tested until it breaks. Russia is teaching NATO a lesson. The alliance was not built to learn. That you can damage an enemy thoroughly, repeatedly, expensively, without ever giving them a legal reason to fight back. The new threshold is no longer where the missiles fly. It is wherever the alliance decides it has finally seen enough. NATO built Article 5 for missiles, not jamming. Subscribe for more on how hybrid warfare rewrites the rules. I'm David. See you tomorrow.